This recording corresponds with Keren Zaiontz' article, Participatory Political Violence, the Censorial Toll of the Truckers' Convoy. Dr. Zaiontz is a UBC professor. She's an assistant professor of theater and performance studies in the Department of Theater and Film and the Bachelor of Media Studies program. So it's possible that you would be able to take courses with Dr. Zaiontz or hear her give a talk on her research. Dr. Zaiontz primary areas of research activity include investigations into digital and embodied art activism, participatory and immersive modes of spectatorship, socially engaged art in redeveloped urban cores, and performing arts festivals and mega events. In her current biography, she notes that her current book project, Authoritarian Intimacies, is a cultural examination of global North authoritarian power from the perspective of its refuseniks, of dissident artists and satirists, independent reporters, and oppositional proletariats who risk everything and model perseverance in the face of repressive rule. So we can understand, on the basis of her broad research interest, why she would be interested in the Truckers' Convoy. This article is published in the journal Canadian Theatre Review, which has been in production since 1974, so 50 years of publications. And it's a journal that's committed to expanding and questioning the intersecting terms in its title. What is Canadian, what's theater, and what constitutes a review? This journal tends to include a lot of full-color images and also be written in a more accessible language. So it's both aesthetically and discursively engaging. Certainly, you can observe within Zaiontz's article the way that the images and fairly substantive image captions contribute to the development of the article and our understanding of the argument that she's making. Each issue of Canadian Theatre Review explores a particular theme. So in this case, the theme being participation. And the editors of that special issue gather artists, critics, emerging and established scholars to share their perspectives, offering a snapshot of pressing issues in performance in Canada today. So it's one of the key kind of journals for publishing research in this area within the Canadian context. And within the arts and humanities, you'll observe that there's a tendency for national formations to be one of the ways that journals are designed. So some journals will focus on, American literature or British film or, French performance, right? That the kind of nation state is one of the organizing structures in which knowledge is produced within the arts and humanities. At the same time, now in the 2020s, many of those journals bring a very critical kind of approach to understanding the construction of nation. And so the idea of the integrity of that nation state, including Canada, is very much actively engaged in the writing and thinking in that work because of the understanding that borders are constructed and that they're also permeated in all sorts of ways. Okay. So in this particular issue, the theme is participation. The issue was edited by Mariah Horner and Jen Stevenson, and they are taking up a conversation that has been part of understandings about theater and performance studies, and the recognition that audiences participate in theatrical activities and become co-creators. So in their introduction, Horner and Stevenson write, more than providing a simple presence, audiences are absorbers of phenomenological impressions and receivers of semiotic signs. Our primary function is interpretive. We are meaning makers. So this quotation substantiates the idea that audiences are not merely passive, but actually names what it is that is their role within the interpretive process, right? That they are absorbing signs and impressions, and that is an essential part of making theatrical activities, right? We need audiences, and we need audiences to be doing these things. Their understanding resonates with what the French artist, 20th century artist Marcel Duchamp writes when he says that all in all, the creative act is not performed by the artist alone. The spectator brings the work into contact with the external world by deciphering and interpreting its inner qualifications, and thus adds his contribution to the creative act, right? So we can really understand here that audiences are co-creators within the creative act, or in other kinds of performance activities, such as the one that Zaiontz discusses. So this leads Horner and Stevenson to think about participation as a term to capture a particular mode of creative audience interaction. So certainly people arrive at a performance as an audience member, but they go on to participate in the construction of that event, the creation of that event, sometimes being invited in particular ways to be forging their own path, or making choices through that experience and customizing their own experience of that performance event. And Horner and Stevenson are drawing on a broader understanding of participation, that we participate in things outside of theatrical actions and performance actions as well. We participate in things like sports and politics. Voting is certainly one way in which we participate in political activities. But they've also noted that there are three catalysts for why thinking about participation matters today, why it's relevant for there to be a special issue around this theme in 2023, and that there's some new kinds of factors for scholars to consider. And the first catalyst is the Web 2.0. So things like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all platforms in which we are invited to participate as makers and consumers of that content. The second catalyst for thinking about participation, why participation matters today, is what's been described as this being the ludic century, the recognition of the gamification of everything, from the roll up the rim to win, to the collection of points for some other kinds of prizes, that there's an immense amount of play involved in our day-to-day life, even within the kind of economic sphere. And this has been attributed to the need for there to be different ways for us to process the vast amounts of information that we are dealt with on a daily basis. And the third catalyst for why they felt compelled to have another conversation about participation is because of the framework of the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene as being a term coined by geologists to describe the impact of human activities on the geological system, and in other words, to name the role that humans play within the climate crisis. And the idea here is that the Anthropocene, so naming the Anthropocene, we are both understood to be observing the climate catastrophe, but we're also responsible to it. We're also being called into action in a particular way because it's a recognition of the impact of human activities on the Earth systems, right? And there's been a much more critical discussion around who is in fact responsible for the Anthropocene. But the broad idea here, right, is that there's a kind of participatory action that is being called into being by virtue of naming the Anthropocene as such and recognizing humans' imprint on Earth systems in ways that previously had not existed. So this conversation that's unfolding about art and other forms of performance is informed by these broader understandings of participation and changes within the ways that we are asked or called on to participate in our daily lives. Horner and Stevenson note that in any situation, we need to be guided in how to participate. So they write, not only do audiences need to know what to do or not to do, but we also want to know that our contribution is necessary. And even when our agency is restricted, that limitation too is a carrier of meaning. How are we welcome or unwelcome? How do we understand the outcomes of our choices? What does it mean if we decide not to participate at all? This opens up another avenue of dramaturgical inquiry, thinking about how we understand agency and the parameters that shape the scope of participation and ultimately the political effects of participation. So we'll recall that word dramaturgy from earlier conversations in the semester as being about the construction of theatrical events. How is it produced? How is it constructed? What are the parameters of this event? And that's exactly the kinds of questions that they were asking there, right? So in naming this, they're really calling for performance studies scholars, including folks like yourselves, to take up these kinds of questions because, in fact, there are important understandings that we can glean about how we understand agency and how we understand the political effects of participation. Okay, so starting to transition over towards Zaiont's contribution to this journal. Zaiontz begins with making this claim. This claim is kind of implicit within it that the Freedom Convoy was a form of participatory political violence. We can understand that on the basis of her title of this article. And so to kind of pull on those questions that Horner and Stevenson were asking in that last quotation, we can imagine how they might start to apply here, asking questions about how are people invited to participate in the Freedom Convoy or the Truckers' Convoy, as she describes it. How did they know if and how they were welcome? How are they instructed to act? What were the outcomes of these choices? Now, some of you may have clear memories of the Freedom Convoy or the Truckers' Convoy. You might have had conversations about it in school or with family members or community members. You might have seen it in different kinds of places if you were living within the territory of Canada during those years. For others, you might be much less familiar with the Freedom Convoy, and so I just have a couple slides here to remind us of what it was that happened. So we can, in a very short form, understand it as a series of protests and blockades in Canada against the COVID vaccine mandates and restrictions. So it began in early 2020 and was originally protesting mandates for border crossing. So when there were the restrictions of border crossings on the basis of the attempts to stop the spread of the COVID-19 virus. So in late 2021, Canada and the US accommodated unvaccinated cross-border truckers by exempting them from COVID-19 vaccine requirements so as to prevent exacerbating existing supply chain disruptions. These exemptions ended on January 15th, 2022 in Canada and January 22nd, 2022 in the United States. Now, at this point of time, 85% of truckers were vaccinated, which left about 15%, which accounted for 16,000 Canadian truckers. Now, this evolved into a much broader protest about COVID-19 mandates in general and the role of the state in determining these kinds of restrictions. So in order to respond to and protest these mandates, the fact that that exemption was no longer going to be offered, hundreds of vehicles formed convoys that eventually converged in Ottawa on January 29th, 2022, with a rally at Parliament Hill. And so if we look at the image on the right, we can see that there's Ponoka, Red Deer, Calgary on the upcoming kind of road. So we could see this as being part of the movement that was moving through Alberta, right, heading all the way east to Ottawa. There were also offshoot barricades that were blocked at provincial capitals and border crossings, including at Coutts in southern Alberta. Eventually, it was guessed that between 5,000 and 18,000 people converged in Ottawa. I know that's a really broad number. It's sometimes very hard to get a sense of how many people were in a place to assemble. But a significant group of people assembled in Ottawa and occupied the downtown core. The organizers of the Freedom Convoy declared that they would not leave Ottawa until all COVID restrictions and mandates were repealed. So although the movement started with the particular resistance to one policy change that would have impacted truckers, it ballooned into a much broader call, right? A much broader kind of protest. Then on February 14th, so recognizing that about 2 weeks have gone by, in fact, more than 2 weeks have gone by, Prime Minister Trudeau invoked the Emergency Measures Act, which had not been invoked since 1988, and mobilized a large police presence to thereby arrest the organizers and protesters, remove the parked vehicles, and dismantle the blockades that were erected in downtown Ottawa. Within about a week, almost everything was dismantled. Now, of course, another part of the story is the questioning around whether Trudeau rightly invoked this Emergency Measures Act, which is really the most substantive act that a prime minister can invoke in order to respond to a kind of crisis of state, a threat to the sovereignty of the nation. So that gives you just a refresher on what it was that's happened. If you reread Zaiont's article, you'll pick up on more of those pieces and be able to fill in more details. But I just wanted to ensure that we had a basic understanding of what was being referred to and why the Truckers' Convoy or the Freedom Convoy began. And so to take up this topic within this journal, the Canadian Theatre Research, or the Canadian Theatre Review, and within a special issue on participation, is to ask questions about how can the tools of performance help us to understand these particular power dynamics. And we hear Zaiontz approaching the Truckers' Convoy as a spectacle, making this claim: the spectacle of hundreds of semi-trucks in Ottawa made it appear as if the industry was staging a revolt, right? So she's using the kind of terms of theater, of performance, to describe what was happening, right? Spectacle, appearance, staging a revolt. And what was important to denote here too, in the way that she's describing it, is the attention to the semi-trucks, right, as being the kinds of props or the things that are enacting a lot of the actions, and then their presence there, their overwhelming presence on the virtue of their size, made it appear as if the whole industry of truckers was staging a revolt, when actually it was there were quite a few of the industry groups who made very explicit notes that they were not doing so, right? Okay, so the as if is being invoked there. So let's pivot now and use those 4 questions to ask when reading an academic article to help us move through this article. So what is the author interested in examining? Well, we get a sense from the opening passages and also the subtitle of the article that there's an interest in the sensorial toll of protest, right? So that which is perhaps not captured in images, although this was very much an image event. If you Google it, you're going to see really a lot of images come up that are interesting and provide information, but there's things that are not captured in the visual realm. And protests are sensory scenes, and so part of her work is to think through and research what were the other kind of aspects of the protest. What was the sensory experience, and how did that contribute to the meaning of what happened there? And so some of those kinds of things that would not be included within the images would be a real sense of the celebratory atmosphere, the kind of frenetic energy in the air, the sense of the movement of bodies, the noise, which was a really important feature of this particular protest. Through its amplification, through loudspeakers, there's a lot of shouting, a lot of loud noise taking place. And also the smells of the food, of garbage on the streets, because with the occupation of this many trucks within downtown Ottawa, it was not possible for other infrastructure to operate in its normal ways, so there was no garbage removal possible, and there was also a lot of diesel being burnt. So those are all sorts of things that she's interested here around the sensory toll of the protest. And what we see her do early on in the article is make a distinction that typically we understand the protest is temporary on the basis of people only being able to suspend their work and life for so long. And then she asks this question, but what happens when the sensorium of participatory protest is pulled by groups on the far right into the ambit of a protracted occupation? And this question is really the one that animates this article, and it's held up for discussion and for answering throughout the body of the piece. Because a research question is what's really animating this article, rather than a major claim, we kind of understand what is the major claim here a bit later on in the article. It takes us a little bit longer to move through and get an impression of what that claim is. And so I have a few different quotes where we start to understand what it is that she's really getting at through her analysis. So here's one of those passages on page 26. She writes that as hundreds of protesters in semi-trucks rolled into Ottawa, blockaded the streets, and with the help of a well-funded off-site logistical network settled in with food and fuel, their demands literally idled in the impassable streets. Their populist message of freedom, freedom from government, freedom from health institutions, set the stage for a white male-dominated scene in the nation's capital that reveled in participatory political violence. So what we can start to understand from this passage is really that she's interested in reading the Freedom Convoy as a form of participatory political violence. If we wanted to think about what the claim is, it might in fact be that the Freedom Convoy is a form of participatory political violence. And we continue to get this sense through additional quotations that are scattered throughout the article, sometimes even brought to our attention in the pull quotes. So another one that's particularly helpful is when she writes that the movement from fringe to center stage, from online to real life, spatialized a new form of participatory political violence in Canada that combined carnival and insurgency. So not only is the Freedom Convoy a form of participatory political violence, it's a new form of participatory political violence. And this new form is the combination of carnival and insurgency. So insurgency as being a part of what is going to resist the nation state and possibly overthrow the government within that. And the carnival as being a kind of holiday of sorts in which there's a reversal of the norms of daily life, a kind of topsy-turvy in which social norms are disregarded and often held up for display and critique. And it also has a kind of sense of merriment and festivity attached to it. So she's saying that these two things hand in hand are new in terms of the ways that political violence has been enacted in Canada in the past. And I've included just a few images of what might be some of the kind of examples, the kind of sense that during the Freedom Convoy, it was almost like a tailgate party where people would gather and eat food and have a kind of like drinks and party. There were sports and activities like that happening on the side streets. And even different kinds of costuming that were kind of absurd were part of the spirit of merriment, but also part of enacting the kind of insurgent ideology on display. And there's a third quote I want to draw to your attention. And this probably gets at an even slightly more precise understanding of her claim. So she writes that during this time out of time, far-right occupiers used sensory forms of public bullying and sensory forms of public nuisance to maintain their hold over the downtown core and its residents. So while enacting carnival and insurgency, this resulted in a kind of sensorial overload, and that is what constituted the occupation itself, right? That it was not just the presence of the bodies and the people, but actually the ways that that space became incredibly noisy and incredibly smelly on the basis of that occupation that was part of the ways that this participatory political violence was being enacted. So we can see those as being key ideas emerging from this article and her analysis. We can then turn towards thinking about what was some of the evidence that she uses to advance this claim. So first of all, we can think about, how was the occupation spatialized? So thinking about, how did it appear in space? And this is the part of the role of the trucks in taking up and occupying public space in the seat of democratic power, right? So in downtown Ottawa, right in front of Parliament Hill. And you can't help but be enticed by the images that produced. So these ideas of insurgency that became entangled within a truckers' convoy became migrated from sort of extremist spaces online to actually being embodied and staged within the nation's capital. And that was then on full display in much of Canadian media. And if you're interested in the way that artists and activists use media to support their causes, in the second part of today's independent learning activity, you should listen to Larry Bogad's talk on tactical performance, because he really gets into that in some interesting examples. So, how is the occupation spatialized? So, through the performance of populism, alt-right personalities and fringe groups are centered. Zaiontz writes that the appearance of the quote-unquote average, dog whistle for white Canadian, the burly everyman trucker, became equivalent with a critical mass that in turn normalized libertarian, extremist, and anti-democratic rhetoric on the streets of Ottawa and national and global media flows. So this is, one of the things that she's really interested in is like, what was the work that these trucks were doing, and how did these extremist ideas become spatialized and centered and taken up within media networks. The second kind of body of evidence that she's really interested in is the testimonial evidence, in particular by Victoria de la Ronde and Ziji Li, who were people living in downtown Ottawa in the occupation zone. And she interweaves testimony from them of what their experiences were like when the truckers and the Freedom Convoy was taking place, and how it disrupted their ability to work and go about their daily lives. So, as I alluded to before, because of the occupation, it meant that other kinds of civil services like snow clearance, like garbage removal, were not possible. Many stores closed, which meant that it was harder to get groceries. Buses shut down, so transportation was disrupted, right? There's a real disruption to what is happening within that space. And Zaiontz has access to their testimonies from one of the inquiries around the public order emergency. And so if you're interested in getting a sense of what that testimony is like and what it would be like to work with testimony in a research project, then for the second part of this independent learning activity, I encourage you to choose that option and watch about 15 minutes of the testimony from this hearing. Legal cases, witness testimony can be really interesting to work with as sources of evidence in your research. And in this particular case, what we hear accounts of are for La Ronde, who is blind and uses her senses to navigate space. Leaving home became too dangerous as she wasn't able to hear what was going on in the environment. And Lee testifies to how the persistence of noise and loud noises and smells contributed to chronic pain and anxiety for her. So we have that kind of second body of evidence that she uses to get at the understanding of the sensorial toll of the truckers' convoy and the effects that it had on individuals within that community, who are living in that community, who experienced the occupation. And then finally, she talks more about the idea of idling as a kind of tactic that is being deployed within this particular occupation, and that is being used in a different way than other forms of idling in protest movements. So the kind of idling of trucks and vehicles is banned in many places because of the pollution that it produces. So Zaiontz notes that while idleness is a feature of occupations across the political spectrum, i.e. suspending time and remarking space, protest rarely idle in ways that actively contaminate the site of the occupation and those local to it. So this is part of what is also distinguishing this protest from other forms of protest that have been enacted in Canada in the past, or even outside of Canada as well. And that this is an interesting kind of shift, she says, as what makes this form of participatory political violence unique. And for her as well, the effect of idling in terms of its production of pollutants to the environment and to those others, cohabitants of that space, relates to the kind of ideologies that were being advanced within this movement around particular ideas of freedom from consequence or responsibility. So this takes us to the final question that we want to ask when we're working through an article: what's at stake in a claim? Zaiontz notes that it is precisely because the convoy claimed that their tactics were celebratory cultural expressions of the people and defended as such on social media, in the courts, and during the public inquiry, that it was difficult to demarcate the occupation as a national threat, as an insurgency of the far right, right? So because of the carnivalesque atmosphere of the truckers' convoy, of this occupation, it was more difficult in order to identify and name it as a national threat. The airing of populist grievance toward coordinated acts of noise and air pollution speaks to an ontological shift in political violence in Canada toward participatory performances of insolence that ultimately mask broader extremist agendas. So the word ontological comes from the word ontology, having to do with the nature of being. So the airing of populist grievance toward these forms of noise and air pollution fundamentally is a shift in the fundamental ways that political violence is enacted in Canada, and it's moving towards participatory forms of insolence that mask broader extremist agendas. And as she's talking about this, she's really questioning, the claims, the language that is being deployed by the organizers of the truckers' convoy and the freedom convoy, particularly in the ways that they talk about freedom and call into question whose freedom is being protected. And finally, what's at stake in this understanding of this kind of fundamental shift towards a new form of participatory political violence, one that is enacted through sensorial overload and that has a kind of celebratory dynamic to it that can in turn mask broader extremist agendas, is that other scholars, probably scholars of theater and performance research, can turn our critical attention to the representational operations of the far right and unmask its calls for freedom for what they truly are: participatory political violence driven by animus toward government, ignorance of science, and distrust of institutions. So she's saying that if we understand this as participatory political violence, we need to name it as such, and we also can bring our tools, our critical tools, to understand the ways that this participatory performance is working, and that other protests may deploy similar tools in the future. Okay, so that's it for my lecture today. Please complete the second part of this independent learning activity as well, and I look forward to chatting more with you about this article in class.